what Landx actually is and what they are actually trying to do, because I think what they're trying to do is very uncommon within our industry, at least in this point. Maybe in a few years we'll see some more projects doing some similar things, at least in a way. But I think that right now it is a very special project.
When you look at real-world assets, you can get those sustainable yields in traditional financial realms, right? People do it all the time with bonds, with government debt, with government paper. A lot of major treasuries heavily invest in these areas as sources of reliable, sustainable yield, right? And then you also have protocols like synthetics that are linking cryptocurrency with some other real world asset classes, basically just bringing them on chain. So they're not reinventing the wheel, right? They're not advertising a 7,000% APR by just pushing endless amounts of tokens. They're just taking something that is already proven to work and has been around for decades and bringing it on chain to make it more efficient, to make it more secure, more transparent. And that's exactly what Landx is doing, but instead of doing it for commodities like gold, precious metals, oil, government debt, things like that, we're doing it for agricultural commodities, right? So cereal grains and soybeans, more specifically. So when I deep dived into the project, first off, it checked that box. Where's the yield coming from if I invest in this project? Well, it's coming from the crops that real world farmers produce. It's not coming from an inflationary tokenomics model. It's coming from something in the real world. So that checked the first box. And then I also noticed that the competitive landscape for agricultural commodities was wide open at the time. It was just completely wide open. Still is, nearly. I mean, we have obviously Landx in the middle of our public and private sales stages, and so we're capturing that market share. But at the time, nobody was doing it. And agricultural commodities, although notoriously unexciting to the crypto investor because we're all here for the volatility, right? Are trillions of dollars change hands all over the world in agricultural commodities. If all you have to do is look at the news, and you'll see information about the Black Sea grain deal falling through, and that the impact there on wheat prices in Eastern Europe with the conflict that's going over in Ukraine right now. Or you look at the ban on non-basmati white rice that India levied on its domestic population in order to try and keep prices reasonable for their people, which is understandable, but nonetheless. So it's an incredibly deep in asset class. Yeah, so those two things combined, just knowing where the yield was coming from, it making sense, good tokenomics, and the competitive landscape being absolutely wide open, it was a no-brainer for me at the time to invest in Landx. And I was really excited to become part of the team and see this project go from ideation to fruition and bring us to where we are right now.
What is actually Landx? What is Landx trying to actually do? Like in the most direct and simplistic way that you can describe it.
You have farmers all over the world who do not have access to financial institutions. They need to borrow money either to expand their operations or move their farms in a different direction. So you have this group of farmers that need access to lending. And then on the other side of that, you have crypto native investors, meaning investors that are only exposed to cryptocurrency, who do not have access to traditional commodities markets. So ideally, and what we've seen is this demographic is made up of treasury managers and DAOs and things like that. So you have these two people on each side. You have the farmers who need lending. On the other side, you have investors who need exposure to agricultural commodities. Landx brings those two together, and we bridge that gap. So investors can get exposure to the crops that farmers produce, and farmers can get lending when they otherwise would not be able to.
Could you talk us through the actual tokenization part? As in, how are these farmers actually getting these tokenized wheat, corn, rice, etc.? How are they actually getting them on chain?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. First and foremost, we utilize Chainlink to link the price of their commodities that they're producing with real world commodity prices that are sourced from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So everything's transparent and comes from incredibly reputable sources there. But to address your question directly regarding how these items get on chain, we have basically three different parties in the Landx ecosystem. Like I said, we have the farmers who need lending, we have the investors who want exposure to the commodities, but in the middle, we have validators, and that's not in the traditional sense like an Ethereum validator or nodes or anything like that, but what they do is they facilitate the interaction between Landx and the farmer. So these validators are people around the world who are already involved in their local farming community. So these could be farmer cooperative representatives, farmer union delegates, anything like that. And when we engage with the farmer, we do so through that validator. The validator is a known party already to the farmer in the vast majority of cases, and they handle the tokenization process. So once a contract is signed with a farmer for lending terms, they're only allowed to borrow an amount that is a fraction of what we can verify they're able to produce every year, right? So at launch, we're starting off at 10%. It's called a maximum allowable crop share. So let's say if they produce, just for simplicity's sake, 1,000 tons of wheat every year, they're only going to be able to borrow against 10% of that, right? Or only able to borrow as much money as 10% of those crop share payments would cover. So the short answer is it goes through that validator who facilitates the signing of the legal contract. All loans, like I said, are secured through a lien with the farmer's farmland. We do verify the value and the production history of that farmland using the NDVI index, the geospatial imagery, satellite imaging. So we're sure that the vegetation levels are there and the historical vegetation levels are there to make sure that everything's being produced and everything checks out and is able to be vetted. So we have we have more, but we have three main tokens in the Landx ecosystem. What's going on right now, the public sale stage 1, as we're recording this, it may have rolled over to stage 2 by the time it gets published, but that's Landx, which is our governance token. That token is required by validators to stake for security purposes when bringing new validators on chain. But it also, anybody who holds LNDX and stakes it is entitled to receive a portion of protocol fees. So it comes with the yield, and then it also comes with governance rights, of course, right? Because it's a governance token with some added utility.
Can anyone technically become a validator then, as long as you hold the required Landx tokens? Like hypothetically, could I become a validator?
No, there's a pretty stringent application process to achieve validator status. We want to make sure these are, valued, esteemed members of farming communities.
The actual tokenized assets themselves, what are they? Are they ERC20s, and what chain are they kind of based on, etc.?
They are ERC20, but whenever a farmer borrows, so then they have to repay a debt, right? And they have to make loan payments, okay? Those loan payments that they're making are essentially, from the farmer's point of view, that's just the crop. So if they harvest corn, they're making their payments in corn. They're not making their payments in tokens. But what they actually do is work with the validator. And in many cases, for these purposes in this process, validators may have power of attorney, so they can execute and do all of this on the farmer's behalf to streamline, simplify the process for the farmer. But what X tokens are is what people hold. So if a user gets X wheat or X corn, to keep in line with our example, they can stake that X corn and they'll receive a yield. The yield they receive is equal to 1 kilogram of corn per year. Okay, so the X tokens that users are receiving are not tokenized commodities, they're fractionalized ownership of that debt repayment obligation, right? So that's how it gets from holding an X token and staking it to sustainable yield that's linked to a real world commodity. Because if you hold 100 X tokens, you basically hold 100 shares of the obligation a farmer has to turn in 100 or whatever the number is, tons of corn every year. And that's how you get your yield in C tokens, which is the token that's actually directly linked to the commodity in the tokenized form of corn in this example. But yes, it's ERC20.
I see. That makes sense. It's pretty exciting, actually, because now there'll be a whole range of kind of new things that you could do. I mean, could you potentially take your tokenized corn and kind of pair it with USDC into a Uniswap pool? Could you put it into a curve pool? Could you use Pendle to trade the yield for how much corn you're going to make in a year?
Right. Yeah.
Lots of really interesting things.
Yeah. So at launch, C tokens, which is the actual tokenized commodities, are going to be redeemable just directly on the Landx DApp for USDC. So if people want to cash out their yield, that's the way they'll do it. But there's no telling. I mean, we all know how it goes as the Legos get stacked in the DeFi sector and derivatives and different instruments pop up. So it'll be exciting to watch, that much is for sure.
What are the actual benefits that Landx is offering to each of these different sectors by using Landx? Like, for example, why should a farmer consider joining Landx or pushing forward to be a part of it? Why should someone want to become a validator? And like, who are the people who can actually become even a validator? And of course, after that, like for an investor, what kind of new investment opportunities are opened because of a product like Landx?
Farmers face a huge problem. There is an incredibly deep funding gap when it comes to agricultural lending all around the world. So the demand for fair lending is universal in the farming world, not necessarily in hyper-developed countries like places in Western Europe and the United States, Canada. Places like that generally have government subsidies for their farmers to remain competitive on the global agricultural scene. But with those exceptions aside, fair lending terms and fair financing is a pretty universal need for farmers. So that's why a farmer would want to engage with Landx. Those are the benefits we offer that crowd. For the validators, they obviously get a share of the loans that they facilitate, the people they onboard, the farmers they onboard. They claim a commission since they are required to stake LNDX to participate as a validator. They also reap the rewards from staking those tokens and getting the yield that's associated with those. But I think honestly, just from a philosophical standpoint, why would someone want to become a validator? Well, like I said, these are people who are involved in their local farming communities. And so if I'm a local farmer in, Southeastern Asia, and I see all of my coworkers, I mean, these are friends and family members, right? And they're struggling and they aren't able to make ends meet, or they're having to sell parts of their land, and this is ancestral land, right, that's gone through their families for ages, but they just can't make enough money to stay afloat. I would become a validator to help, the people I know, to help my community, to make sure that they can get connected to an international marketplace where their rice harvests are fairly valued. They're not, bought for 10% of their value and then turned around and sold for the profit of a giant conglomerate or, institution or company or something like that. So I think that's a big part of becoming a validator. Yes, it's profitable, but I think more so than that, the people who become validators have an altruistic desire to help their communities around them. That would be my judgment on that, just based on my experience, which is admittedly a narrow scope, and you're going to have different scenarios in every case. And finally, to answer your question about investors, So farmland is obviously very, very valuable. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, everybody is buying up just tons and tons of farmland. The price of farmland has been trending up for decades. The population of the planet continues to rise, and they're not making any more farmland, right? In fact, it's going the other way. Arable land is decreasing and has been for quite a while. So it's just a no-brainer. I mean, it's like I said at the beginning of the show, it's kind of unexciting to the crypto investor, right? Because commodities, especially agricultural commodities, aren't known for their volatility. I mean, they're a hedge against inflation and a hedge and volatility resistant, uncorrelated to other markets. But that's exactly the reason the big boys like institutions and VCs and giant investment firms target agricultural commodities, because they know it's an incredibly valuable part and necessary part of a comprehensive portfolio, a comprehensive investment strategy, right? So I think just the desire for agricultural commodities is very conspicuous to the experienced investor. It's a no-brainer. I mean, it's a very attractive asset class to hedge against inflation, of course, because it's outperformed just inflation currencies themselves for years and years. And the lack of volatility is a perfect offset for things like tech stocks or cryptocurrency when markets pump or dump, right? That's just not going to happen with commodities. And it's a recession-resistant asset class. Yeah, and then pairing it just with that constant yield that comes from the farmers' crops that they turn in. And it's not that you just are buying corn and holding it. You're buying repayment obligation that in perpetuity produces a yield of that commodity. So I think there are a lot of reasons for investors to be interested. So there are a lot of projects out there that have one token because that's all they need. Landx, obviously, we have a irrefutable justification for every token in our ecosystem, right? So we have Landx, which is the governance that we've talked about, and utility token that is in the public sales stages right now. And then we have the X token, so X wheat, X rice, X soy, X corn, that are fractionalized debt obligations, right, that people can hold. And then what do those X tokens produce? They produce C tokens, which are the actual tokenized on-chain representations of 1 kilogram of an underlying commodity.